going to be discussing Islamophobia, passports, and citizenship, or there or thereabouts, inspired by Arzu Merali from the Islamic Human Rights Commission and her essay on how Islamophobia makes contemporary Germany and what the new citizens for old scenario is looking like rather. We've got a whole wave of issues around race, of course, the continued rise of the racist right wing across Europe. We know about Shumaima Begum's citizenship revocation here in England, which is, still a case that's ongoing, but they seem to be very reluctant to give her citizenship. We know that the ISIS returnees, most of whom were recruited in all probability, if not absolutely definitely, by Western intelligence services, are now not allowed back here either, sort of persona non gratis. The migrant crisis, of course, has been going on for decades with the influx of European workers. It made it particularly problematic for many people living and working in England, and has caused a lot of underground resentment, a genuine resentment within the mainstream populace, rightly or wrongly. The fact is that it's happened. And a climate of fear and what Sister Arzu and IHRC have described as a climate of hatred basically has emerged. And it indicates a ticking time bomb of conflict and violence potentially in Western society. COVID-19 may well have temporarily taken the headlines, but it's even now the economic fallout from that is arguably simply going to trigger more Islamophobia and race hate in the West. It's not going to make it any easier for those who live here in Europe. Arzu is no stranger to most of our public who watch this show, but she's a writer, researcher based in London. She is one of the founders of Islamic Human Rights Commission, formerly editor-in-chief of Palestine Internationalist, and currently one of the editors at The Longview. She has, that's a magazine which deals with all sorts of current affairs globally, related largely to the Muslim world and Muslim communities. She has contributed to the upcoming publication of Muslim Experiences of Hatred and Discrimination in Germany, alongside Syed Amali and Ibrahim Mohsin Ahui. She is also a co-author of The Environment of Hate, The New Normal for Muslims in the UK, and other books, reports, and articles. Welcome to the show, Arzu. Good, we might have a little bit of a sound issue there, but hopefully that'll work in a few minutes once I get talking to you. Maulana, welcome to the show. Obviously, you need no introduction. Hujjatul Islam wal Muslimin, Sayyid Muhammad Razavi, head and founder of the Religious Advisory Board, a body which disseminates all sorts of problem-solving solutions and answers on an Islamic basis. But Maulana's particular forte is that he's socio-politically very aware, having worked in Britain for more than 3 or 4 decades in the field of Islamic community work, and his observations on this issue of citizenship, passports, and the new normal that we seem to be developing for the way that Muslims are viewed in Western nations. But I'm going to begin with Arzu, and hopefully we've got the sound. Arzu, in your latest essay, this piece on the new citizens for old, how Islamophobia makes contemporary Germany, you begin by talking about the way that the precedents in Germany are being set are extremely worrying, and also that the arguments that to be a citizen in the current age means to be and believe only one thing, i.e. a sort of mono-ideological imposition coming largely from neoliberal forces in the background, lobby groups, and churned out then as policy by government. Tell us a little bit about the content of your essay, just the broad outlines to get us started, and why you think there is such a problem, and using Germany, of course, as your case study.
Well, Germany, I hope you can, if you didn't hear me before, thanks for having me on again. Germany is a really interesting case study. I mean, as much as we're in the UK and, we've talked about Brexit, we're actually relationship in terms of ideas has been deeply embedded and continue to be so for a very long time. That essay really looks at the kind of two Germanys, if you like, that exist at the moment when it comes to issues around citizenship. It's one which is really, really worrying, very troubling. It's almost going down the same road that, 180, 90 years ago in terms of demonizing a particular minority or minority peoples generally. And there's another Germany which is back against that. And I think both of these are really salutary examples because, upon anything else, that kind of very, for want of a better phrase, racist Germany has been very impactful across Europe as the policy has set out, not least, ironically, in the UK. And, as I say in the article, don't tell the Brexiteers, but actually this kind of restrict citizenship, of introduction, or like the environment that we have, or the detention and deportation of asylum, and just even issues around emotional belonging, which is a key to citizenship. It's not just a passport or the organization certificate or your birth certificate. It's a feeling that you belong to the country of your citizenship, feeling belonged, feeling loved, in other words, by not just wider society, but in particular the institutions and the state itself. And what we see in those terms in Germany, that now vision is opening even the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom, as those of us of a certain age will remember clearly, was supposed to be the doyen of another model of naturalism, of actually having a plural vision of what society should be, and even of ultimately the principles of government should work. So not only have we gone that way, the rest of Europe has no longer got kind of example to look at, except that, as I said, there are some instances of pushback in Germany, which I think we can also learn from. But it's all, and I think, we should underestimate, it gets quite easy as English-speaking people to think, well, David Cameron or Boris Johnson or Tony Blair, or even what we just thought. There are a lot more other, unfortunately, powerful and not so well-intentioned players around in the world.
Well, thank you, Arzu. I'm just going to request you might be able to get you to put a microphone. We were cutting out with some of the words you were saying. I wasn't getting them clearly, studio. If something can be done about that, just to make sure we get Arzu's narrative absolutely succinctly. But yeah, Arzu's really got the ball rolling, Maulana. I mean, of course, from a community perspective, how worrying is it for Muslims, for instance, who've lived here for now, 6, 7 decades or more, and just when we thought we were all settled and we'd been accepted and the whole racism thing seemed to be being dealt with equal opportunities and multiculturalism, here's Arzu now telling us that actually all of that needs to be fought for again in a way, because the forces that would have us reverse all of those processes are well and truly on the march, and they're not just right-wing extremists. It does seem as though a lot of that ideology has seeped into mainstream, what would we describe now as mainstream politics. Le Pen in France, the Netherlands have got their own versions of these quite right-wing fascist-sounding parties, which are populist. Indeed, Le Pen could even win the next election in France, and so too may be the case in several other European nations. So how do you feel about the community's ability to cope with this new tide of Islamophobia, next level of Islamophobia, and of course the underlying racism that undoubtedly underpins it as well? How do you think the communities, the Muslim communities particularly, are equipped to be able to deal with such a situation, firstly?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, it entirely depends on the level of faith and iman, and also the level of awareness that exists in the community, and if the community leaders have played their role in making the community members aware or not, or in majority of the cases the scholars and the leaders are themselves not aware of what is going on, and they are not that bothered and interested in sorting out the problem. If we have that kind of leader and that kind of community centers, of course, we will not have a strategy to move on and deal with such issues. But if we create awareness between the Muslims and then trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the verses of Holy Quran and the promises that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made, that if we make an effort in right direction, He will help, and His help will definitely assist us. And we should always, I repeatedly say that we should always have firm belief and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has promised that al-Islamu ya'lu wa la yu'la ilayh. I usually translate that submission to the will of God will be always above everything else. So we do need to be alert, but we do not need to be afraid. We should not create fear in our community and members and especially children and future generation. We should give them confidence to have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also learn and study and then learn how to deal with the problems without getting any harm, or at least minimizing the damage that they may face dealing with such problems and issues.
Well, let me stay with you, Maulana, because you grew up through that era when fascism and the right was, manifested in the form of National Front movement or the British movement at that time. The fact was that the black communities, generally lots of right-minded mainstream sort of English fraternity or British fraternity also joined us in the struggle for equality. That mood was there, and there was an acknowledgement that this was fundamentally wrong. I don't feel that we've got that acknowledgement about Islamophobia yet within either the establishment, which itself is institutionally Islamophobic, it can pretty powerfully be argued, but also at the grassroots level, the sympathy for Muslims or for Islam being discriminated against or being targeted, it's not really that same scale of emphatic, if you like, support that the anti-racist movement had back in the 70s, 80s. That's one difference. And so how does the community, and you talked about really us standing up and not being afraid, but with the youngsters also who may not be as politically astute, not as politically active, not necessarily seeing the problems either, do you think that we are in a more vulnerable position than we were back in the 70s and 80s? And if so, can we educate youngsters? Can we educate the community in some form from our Islamic centers, etc., about this?
Yes, of course, we can train, and there are weaknesses which are emerging now, and some leaders and centers are becoming aware, and they want to change the direction of the centers where they are going, especially in training and upbringing of the youth. It is extremely important that we do that. But whatever we have achieved, we should not be unthankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and especially we should not discourage those minimum number of youth who are aware and have basira and they understand the problem. They should not be discouraged, they should be encouraged, and they should be given the responsibility to create awareness amongst the other youth, because as Quran says very clearly that people who guide you should be from youth. So if you want to guide the youth, us elderly can be just advisor there, but the youth have to take on their own leadership in their hands with our supervision and consultation of the experts and experienced people and organizations such as IHRC and other centers.
Thank you for that, Maulana. Arzu, I thought I'd let Maulana expound on how he thinks we ought to react to this kind of phenomena, which doesn't get taken seriously. In your piece, you talk about something called philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. We've seen how the Jewish community or the Zionist community, arguably, have rallied and can punch well above their weight, some would say, by even getting the Labour Party to completely, create an entire, investigative self-destruction mechanism over that issue of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to comment on it one way or the other in terms of detail, but in terms of Muslims and Islamophobia, we don't have that same level of power. And you argued that these ideas, racist and genocidal past of Germany in particular, you alluded to, and you mentioned somebody called Sarrazin and his book, which started to hark back to those kind of those notions, the old sort of Nazi notions almost of eugenicists. Ideas around eugenicist sort of concepts and superiority of races. Is it really that bad? Are we getting to that level that we've got these sort of ideas? And then the thing that you put out rather frighteningly is that these ideas travel. Australia's picking them up, and evidently this chap, Mr. Sarrazin's ideas are certainly traveling across Europe, even as far as here in the UK. Tell us a little bit about the scale of this kind of ideology's reach.
I think we're all of a certain age that we remember being taught in school, at least in the United Kingdom, about the eugenicist racism of the Nazis, and this being, we were being taught that as something that's both completely horrific and immoral, and at the same time something of the past. And certainly the Sarrazin moment in Germany was very important, because Germany has, with all its failings, it never got rid of this kind of far-right undercurrent, etc., had gone through this process of supposedly denazification. Okay, so even on the institutional level and the state level, there was what's called a culture of contrition. There was, rightly so, an acknowledgement of its genocide on racist past, the immorality of it, and certainly it's gone on for generations, actually, rather than just even the generation that was involved, this kind of sense of collective guilt. So the Sarrazin moment was a very, very troubling one, because in a country that has this explicit culture of dealing with its extraordinarily violent past, to then have somebody come up and say, relatively similar things about another group, and not only it, of course it did actually, to be fair, in terms of the commentariat and public intellectuals and sort of middle classes, yes, people did say, no, this is completely unacceptable. However, as people who followed the polls, etc., saw, in opinion polls, about half of Germany said, well, he's broadly speaking, he's right. So, as much as they could decode that what they had done to Jews was wrong, it became something of the past that had been done to Jews, and that they could not see that actually it was the same thing all over again, starting or continuing with Muslims as the, demonized group. Now, that was 2010 when his book came out. We're now in 2021, and you've seen in the last few years kind of conferences actually talking about eugenicist thinking taking place in London, at universities. And whilst there's been a bit of backlash, these are now becoming normalized. You do find these kind of arguments turning up in, broadsheet papers, in opinion pieces. You have public intellectuals who are not shying away from talking about things like, not allowing, they will say minorities or actually, working class people to have so many children. Things that basically, at least when I was growing up, was an absolute taboo to say. So yes, this is all over the place, and it's very much interlinked with this idea of citizenship and being only the one thing, and who controls that one idea. You said in the introduction this was sort of being foisted upon us by corporations, etc., but actually it's a very old idea. It's actually where Europe comes from, that Europe is just about sort of single ethnos, single faith nation states, right? And as much as I guess we thought, this has been dealt with and we're sorting it out, at least in the UK and other places, looking at multiculturalism, clearly we hadn't. We'd completely failed. And we've really got to quickly look back at how we can, at the very least, reimagine how we live together, how we can have some kind of political entity where basically it's not all about the one idea and everybody else is ripe for the killing.
Well, you also say in your essay that despite the counter-interventions to the move rightwards that you outlined in the paper, there seems to be no escaping the direction of travel in German society and politics. And you also say it makes little difference if the Chancellor Angela Merkel states that Islam has become part of Germany, if it's prefaced by the statements that Germany has been historically Christian and Jewish, and are only made because the Interior Minister Horst Seehofer at that time stated Islam does not belong in Germany. So it was a reaction to that comment from a very senior minister within the government. Islam does not belong in Germany. The narrative of belonging, you say, cuts across Europeanized borders. What should be the right of a citizenship, as I think you were just emphasizing now. Maulana, this political culture of hating on Muslims, there is an undercurrent. I mean, it's been described as systemic, structural Islamophobia, and also, of course, racism. But the two things are interlinked, although there's a big debate that goes on about whether Islamophobia can be called racist or not. That's another thing that maybe Arzu might be able to help us out with. But it sounds to me like there is a real serious issue here, which we've taken far too lightly. And these ideas, really, in terms of grassroots organization, can you think of any specific Muslim organizations in this country who are working specifically on this issue? Count out IHRC, because I know that they, as a human rights organization, do all sorts of things, and one of those things is definitely taking on these sort of narratives. But in terms of 3 or 4 million Muslims, maybe 5 million Muslims, arguably even in Britain now, if the next census comes out, there could be a massive jump in the number of Muslims here. The mind would boggle if out of those 4 or 5 million, we don't have a single specialist organization that really deals head on with this kind of issue right now. Do you know of any?
Well, I mean, there are very few organizations who have embarked on dealing with such issues, and majority of the organizations are just very traditional centers. I mean, I went to one of the mosques in London. Suddenly, at the time of prayer, everybody came rushingly, and mashallah, the hall was fully packed. And then, as soon as the prayer finished, everybody just disappeared like sheep. I mean, without even knowing each other, understanding what is going on in the community, in the society. Even the khutbahs of the imams are basically written khutbahs, and some of them just prefer to repeat the same khutbah again and again and again without creating any kind of awareness, and without giving any education to the people who are attending those khutbahs. I mean, and in reality, the instruction is that the khutbah, at least one sermon of the Jummah prayer, should be on the current issues and the problems that Muslim community is facing locally and then internationally. But in reality, we don't see any kind of awareness being given, although now we have social media and lots of channels, but unfortunately, Sunni and Shia channels, majority of them, they just, what they have done is picked the member and from the Hussainia or mosque and brought it onto TV, which is wrong. TV and social media should be used for education and creating awareness within the community members, and that is the responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to every single individual, and especially to ulama.
Well, Maulana, I mean, very powerful words there. Sounds socio-political awareness as a responsibility for community leadership. But is it that we've got a problem amongst Muslims as well? Because there is a separation of religion and politics, which has also been there without a doubt. Most Muslims follow the rituals, follow some of the cultural practices, but very rarely will talk about Islam as a political force, or its political perspectives, or its social perspectives. Do we need to have a sea change in the way that we present ourselves? And what are the hurdles for that? Because number one is the psychological hurdle of like having a prepackaged ritualistic Islam, getting beyond commemorations and celebrations and the worship that we do. And then, of course, there's the other aspect, which is that now the Charities Commission and such folk are quietly telling many of the Muslim organizations that you're a charity and you're a mosque or you're an institution. You can't be dealing with politics. So that would scare them even more, wouldn't it? And yet here's a socio-political issue, which if the Muslim and the mosques and the mosque leaders don't deal with properly or don't get involved in, the first targets I would say to them, I would suggest to them and to yourself, is a mosque. Because what could be more obvious than a huge building with a minaret and a dome standing in the middle of a town where racists have maybe emerged? Who do you think they're going to target as firebombs or target in terms of paint daubing or throwing pigs' heads? And we've had these incidents across the country already. Surely it's the mosques and these folk who should be even more concerned, being on the front line of a potential racist, violent kickback. Maulana, for you, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, the creating awareness is the responsibility of the scholars and ulama. I mean, look at the khutbahs of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and holy imams. They used to discuss everything in the khutbah. They used to answer the questions. I mean, people were allowed to stand up and raise hand and ask a question to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam directly and request him to address the issue that Muslim community was facing and going through. And until this is not changed, until we don't learn how to, first of all, create awareness within ourselves, I mean, within the leaders, and then create the awareness within the community members, we will not achieve anything.
So, Arzu, bringing you back in, you start talking about how this process can be reversed by, if you like, the German establishment itself. Let's keep to Germany and use it as the example. We could use any number of other European nations. But as you've got this German case study, I want to delve a little more deeply about what they can do, the establishment can do to reverse some of this trend that no doubt they've been part and parcel of creating, you know, favoring Christianity over religious pluralism, arguably, you know, arguments about bans against the hijab you talked about, you know, that have been raging, and, you know, it's been banned in Switzerland. I think the niqab certainly been banned just in the last week or so. So what are the things that European establishment, and let's say Germany, should do, you know, looking at, say, inspiration from perhaps, say, the German Enlightenment? Is there any inspiration they can take from their past and from any hope we can have of them changing things?
There's an interesting intervention by a former president of Germany, actually, or Hannes Rau, who's now deceased, at the time when there was a furore, I think in 2004. I mean, they continue to today, actually, with regard to Germany. And he actually spoke about it. He was a practicing Christian, and he was talking about the sort of the paper constitution, talking about equality, but saying, well, you know, this equality is not kind of applied in a way that is meaningful to people of different faiths. And his idea about Germany as a Christian country, and I think I largely don't disagree. I mean, I don't think it's a problem that, you know, the majority of people, if they want to have the flavor or the name of Christianity as something that's special to them, that's not the issue. The issue is it shouldn't be the basis of then discriminating against other people or, you know, denigrating other people who are not Christians, specifically people of other faiths, like Jews and Muslims, okay? And he actually referred, Johannes Rau, to Nathan the Wise, which is a play from the German, which was very influential as a kind of founding text of the German Enlightenment. And this revolves around basically a story of accepting different religions as equally valid because you don't basically know which one is real, okay? It was kind of clever story set at the time of the Crusades, where, you know, there was a Jewish character, a Muslim character, and a Christian character who, you know, should have all been enemies, but somehow ended up learning this lesson. And he took from that and he quoted, and it was a kind of a profound moment. And it shows you that there's actually kind of historical interventions there. You know, Germany as a nation state is only 150 years old. it needs to kind of wake up to its own kind of very recent history. You know, it's not about Germany eternally and then some Muslims turned up and caused some problems 20 years ago. It's nothing like that. All of these borders are artificial. And so whether it's Germany or the UK or anywhere else, there has to be a kind of understanding of situatedness, of, you know, being historically migrants themselves. Okay, I mean, it's very much the case in the United Kingdom. There's a project actually here called, well, it's escaped me, so I forgot it now, My Migration History, something like that. And it goes back 2,000 years, and you'll see there's 2,000 years worth of immigration coming to the United Kingdom. There's no true Brit in that sense, or true English person.
Sure.
And you can argue the same thing about Germans. Germans emigrated all over the Europe. It's only after the Second World War that they've been concentrated in this very small space. So it's about, you know, states waking up and smelling the coffee and being honest about their history. Now, you know, that is the moral imperative for them. And I think part of the issue is that, you know, we are talking a lot, and rightly so. I agree with what Maulana Saab is saying about Muslims not really getting their act together or having their act together. But at the end of the day, the change has got to come from the state. And there's only so much education that Muslims can do. They have to be moral.
Sorry. Yeah. 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 So staying with you, on this issue, of course, there are really strange things going on within the citizenship tests. I mean, I know that the Germans waived citizenship stay rights for those children who were born of workers, because there was no German citizenship for the workers that came from Turkey, etc. For a long while, but the next generation seems to have been given German citizenship. Then you had the 1 million who were allowed in from Syria and whatnot to come as necessary workers. So there were signs that Germany was turning the corner, but it seems as though there's been a lot of opposition to that as well. But your work at IHRC, I'll mention, on the domination hate model of intercultural relations, looks at Germany. And it has some detailed recommendations. Could you let us know some of those recommendations? I mean, it talked about nuanced, robust citizenship education, for instance. Any other things from that report that you'd like to give our own community a hint, or even the powers that be that might be watching? Sorry, do we still have Arzu on the line? We may not have you on the line.
Hello?
Yeah, I think. Hello, yes, we've got you, yeah. Hello, yes,
I've got
you, yeah. Did you hear the question, Arzu?
I heard the question. Basically, there's any number of recommendations that can and have been made. We have huge issues around policing and profiling. They're not too dissimilar to other countries, including the UK. But again, you know, there have been sort of studies already made about motivations for police officers and their views, etc., etc. In some ways, it's better than in this country, upon which actual kind of work can be done. You know, how can you train police officers not to reproduce problems? At the end of the day, they're frontline workers. What about the hierarchy of how are they creating a problem? Well, we have to get rid of some of the policy language, like immigrant background. You said, yes, since 2000, people born, children of quote unquote guest workers do get German citizenship. That was something that wasn't happening before. You know, they're still described as citizens with an immigrant background. I mean, what use is that? And that's not used in a flattering way. It's policy speak that is usually used to, denote some kind of problem. So we have to be changing the language, and we need a better, more robust political culture. You know, you mentioned it before, but it's no good that, a minister can stand up and say Islam has no place in this country, and then only Chancellor Merkel says, no, Islam has a place in Germany. But it's been, and then quickly say, but it's historically been a Christian and Jewish nation. 100 years ago, whoever was the chancellor would not have said Germany is a Christian and Jewish nation, even though it had that history. So, it's about self-awareness again. It's about making the story of the nation and doing it in a way that encompasses everybody. And that's what all nations do. We're not asking for anybody to reinvent the wheel. We're just asking it for it to be done honestly and openly. And that's a lesson for all countries. And there is scope in Germany, as we talked about, in a way that I think, growing up, most of us thought, well, Germany is a write-off, they don't even give citizenship to people who've been born there, blah, 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 blah. No, things have moved. I tend to write very pessimistically about things. That's because the problems are great, but there is always scope to change things. There's always ways to push back. It's just about keeping on pushing and not getting deflated.
So, Maulana, there's a general trajectory of trying to make Muslims or Islam seem totally incompatible with Europe. And earlier I quoted one of the interior ministers who's saying, Islam doesn't belong in Europe. Firstly, does Islam belong in Europe? And secondly, let me just outline some of the fault lines that keep getting highlighted. For instance, the neoliberals will keep pointing out to the fact that Muslims don't get on with, we don't, even things like handshaking, like women not handshaking a man or a man not handshaking a woman could be turned into a political issue. The wearing the niqab or the hijab has become a political issue. These are almost like politically they should be not even a matter of concern, yet they're making these little molehills into mountains in the face of such kind of what I would describe as contrived propaganda tools, and there's lots of them. They use the FGM, which was another false flag, the female genital mutilation, which was lumbered on Muslims, the grooming gangs up in northern England, which again get labelled as Muslim when it's necessary. The terrorists who roll out time and time again are rolled out as Muslims, even though it's quite clear that much of what they're doing is our political false flags and whatnot going on. Yet this has been a sort of steady and very concerted effort by neoliberal, neoconservative forces. Is there any hope that we have to be able to explain to the rest of the Western public here that actually, look, we're not much different from you. We may agree with the right in terms of their traditional stance on family, for instance, but we may also disagree with them on their endless perpetual wars on foreign countries or their abuse of other nations' wealth. We may agree with the far left on reducing the wealth gap, but we may disagree with them on homosexuality, for instance, or gender fluidity. I mean, this is surely part of the normal makeup of any society, that we shouldn't have to conform, as Arzu's pointed out, we shouldn't have to conform to some monocultural, monopolitical viewpoint. Surely that's not what democracy is about. How do we express that on a wider basis and really get that point to stick?
Well, I mean, if the biggest problem is that the world is controlled by people who do not believe, and this is what their aim is, to create a one world order which is against any divine faith. Although in some cases they do pick up the flag of Christianity or Judaism or something else, but in reality they are just selfish. So we have to confront those kind of people, and we should establish unity amongst the true believers, those who have submitted their will to will of God, not these interfaith meetings that and we know very well what is the aim behind it. We as a human, we as a Christian, Jews and Muslims and followers of the divine faith should become aware of what is going on in our society and create awareness and move forward. Otherwise, they are against religion, and they will undermine the growth of not only Islam, any other religion as well. Recently, I've heard that in France, apparently, they have banned halal meat or slaughter of halal meat as well. So these things are going on and on.
Well, thank you very much. Sadly, we've come to the end of the program, but I will give Arzu the last word. 1 minute, Arzu, just in conclusion, any sort of final concluding remarks from you about this whole business of citizenship, our identity, and the way our political stance should be in Europe now as Muslims.
I think I would just really encourage your viewers to sit down and give a moment's thought about their expectations as a citizen of the country they're in. We tend to, I'm including myself in this, we tend to normalize our experiences of being discriminated against and just take it for granted that we don't have a say. I'm not saying pick up the number 10 and start making demands, but You have a right to want recognition from the state you're in. We work, we pay taxes, we do what everybody else does. It's time that we try to get some confidence, at least in ourselves, to think about the things that we want to see in the future, not just for ourselves or just for Muslims, but for society as a whole.
Thank you very much, Arzu, and thank you very much, Maulana.
You
We'll have a little read of this wonderful, I think, magazine that, which contains essays and all sorts of other contemporary issues which IHRC produce. The long read, it's available, I think, on the IHRC website. And really, the final message is very simple. We need to really get our act together politically, not be so nihilistic. You can influence the system on the inside, or at least you can certainly act as a resistance force to slow down some of the neoliberal, anti-Islamic or Islamophobic policy development. You can work as an external force, in terms of organizing and educating your own children. You can also reach out to your own local communities. Don't do national politics. Go and influence your local councillors, your local MP, and make sure that they know what you want, and organize yourselves in a way where you're not just looking for power or for a taxi license or a new council house, but actually start using your MPs, using your political field to make your numbers count. There are 4 or 5 million of Muslims that are going to emerge or have already emerged in this country. Surely that's got to count for something politically. And I certainly think that if we made enough noise, were politically far more organized, we'd have far more, if you like, clout, and we'd be able to at least stand some chance of creating a resistance against systemic Islamophobia and the kind of march of the racist right, which cannot go unanswered by ourselves, certainly not by remaining dormant and waiting for others to clean up our problem for us. That's just not the Muslim way. We need to step up to the plate, if you like, and actually